March 1st. Mark that date on your calendar immediately. Not in pencil, but in permanent ink.
Right, yeah. That is definitely one way to open a financial report. It's got a bit of almost a cinematic flair to it, doesn't it?
It really does. It feels way less like a bank memo and more like the opening crawl of a thriller movie or something, like the clock is ticking and all that.
Yeah.
But anyway, welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're tackling a document that's making some very loud noises in a very quiet and often overlooked corner of the financial world.
Oh, for sure. Very overlooked.
Yeah, and the title of the source material is The March 1st Global Currency Reset. And look, if you're listening to this, you likely already know we aren't talking about the S&P 500 here. We aren't talking about crypto bro memes, and we definitely aren't talking about your standard 401k strategy.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
This is firmly in let's call it the alternative layer of finance. We're looking at what is often called the GCR, or Global Currency Reset.
Right.
And specifically, this source material is zeroing in on two currencies that are pretty much the absolute darlings of a very specific high-risk, high-reward investor community. So that's the Vietnamese Dong and the Iraqi Dinar.
And the claim here is just massive. It's not subtle at all. The source basically argues we are at a critical juncture. They actually say the tectonic plates of the global financial system are shifting.
Yeah, tectonic plates. That's big language.
It is. And to be clear, for you listening, they aren't talking about a quarter-point interest rate hike from the Fed or some minor adjustment in inflation targets. They are describing a fundamental change in the actual plumbing of how money moves around the world.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to just decode that specific claim. We need to unpack why this report argues that Vietnam, of all places, right, is the trigger for this massive global mechanism.
Right, Vietnam.
Yeah. And we also need to explain what ISO 2022 is without, putting everyone to sleep, because apparently it's the key to this whole thing. And finally, we have to look at the weird link they draw between manufacturing in Hanoi and the Central Bank of Iraq.
Which on the surface seems like a massive stretch. I mean, one makes sneakers, the other pumps oil.
Yeah, totally different worlds.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds, we do have to do our standard housekeeping. We are analyzing the logic and the claims presented in this specific text. We are acting as your guides to this viewpoint. We are not indicting these predictions, and we certainly aren't giving you financial advice.
Right, no financial advice here.
We are just here to see what the source says and really just stress test the narrative they're building.
Precisely. We're just looking at the internal consistency of the theory. Like, does A actually lead to B in their argument? And the logic here starts with the distinction the author makes between incremental steps and what they call a quantum leap.
So let's start right there, the quantum leap. The source focuses heavily on Vietnam to start off. It says for years we've been watching Vietnam take baby steps. Little adjustments here and there, a cent here, a fraction there. But the argument is that we're done with baby steps now.
Right.
They claim Vietnam has essentially triggered a mechanism to fundamentally alter how the Dong is calculated.
Yeah, that is the core premise. Yeah. The source identifies March 1st as the effective activation point for this new calculation method. But to really understand why that matters, we have to look at the actual technical shift they're describing. So historically, the Vietnamese Dong has been pegged.
Right, pegged to the U.S. dollar. So essentially, the State Bank of Vietnam wakes up, looks at the U.S. dollar and says, this is what our money is worth relative to that today, and they just keep it stable.
Yeah.
It's an artificial stability.
Correct. It's a strict peg, which simplifies trade, historically speaking. But the source argues that leading up to this March 1st window, Vietnam is transitioning from that singular peg to a market basket global valuation.
Market basket. It sounds like something from a supermarket sweep game show.
Yeah, it does.
But in Forex terms, this is a much bigger deal than a peg.
Oh, absolutely. It's a significant maturation in their monetary policy.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of your currency's fate being tied to just one partner, the U.S. dollar, it's tied to a weighted average of several major currencies. It's all about balance.
Gotcha.
And the source actually lists the contents of this new basket. It's the euro, the Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan, and yes, still the US dollar.
So it's diversification. It's not putting all your eggs in the American basket anymore. It's them saying, hey, we trade with Europe, we trade with China, we trade with Japan. Our currency should reflect that.
Exactly. But the source frames it as a graduation of sorts. It's Vietnam saying we are stable enough and our economy is complex enough to play the field. The text actually uses a really interesting phrase here. It says, Vietnam is effectively declaring it is no longer just a discount shop for cheap labor. It is the new factory of the world.
And that brings us to the economic logic, which I actually found to be the most compelling part of the document, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because usually the narrative with these developing economies is that they want a cheap currency. It helps exports. Like if I'm making sneakers in Ho Chi Minh City, I want the dong to be weak, so my sneakers are cheap for Americans to buy at the mall. Why would they want to change that?
Right. That is the traditional view. It's often called the mercantilist approach.
Yeah.
Keep your money cheap, sell more stuff. And the source totally acknowledges that. It says that for decades, the artificially suppressed dong was a feature, not a bug.
Right.
Because it attracted massive foreign investment. Samsung, Nike, Intel, they all flocked there because labor was incredibly cheap. But here is where the argument pivots. The source claims that this model has hit a tipping point.
A breaking point, I think they called it.
Right, breaking point. The argument is that when a country's GDP and manufacturing output hit a certain threshold of sophistication, that cheap currency flips. It literally stops being an asset and becomes a liability. It's the middle income trap in action.
I really like the analogy of the shoes that I scribbled down while I was reading this. It's like wearing shoes that are too small.
Okay, yeah.
They helped you run fast and be agile when you were a kid because they were tight and light. But now you're a grown adult and they're just crushing your feet. You just can't run a marathon in baby shoes.
That's a great way to visualize it. And the source actually lists specific consequences of keeping the currency too low for too long. First, it invites sanctions. You just can't keep your currency artificially low forever without big players like the U.S. Treasury stepping in and labeling you a currency manipulator.
Which brings tariffs and trade wars. Not exactly what you want if you're trying to be a global player.
Exactly. But the second point is even more practical for Vietnam's actual goals. It makes importing technology prohibitively expensive. If Vietnam wants to move from just sewing t-shirts to manufacturing microchips, which is their stated goal, they need to buy advanced, super expensive machinery from Germany, Japan, or the US.
And if their currency is dirt cheap, that German robot arm costs a fortune. It's like trying to buy a Ferrari with pennies.
Precisely. Their purchasing power is just too low to upgrade their own infrastructure. And then the third point was about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Full integration into high-level global trade requires compliance standards that, according to the source, are just impossible to meet with a manipulated, suppressed currency.
So the argument is that Vietnam is essentially declaring itself a premium manufacturer, and a premium manufacturer needs a premium investment-grade currency. You just can't build high-end electronics if you can't even afford the tools to make them.
That's the why. Vietnam needs to grow up, financially speaking.
Yeah.
Now, we really have to talk about the how, because this isn't just a policy paper where politicians shake hands for a photo op. The source gets deep into the actual plumbing of the banking system here. They introduce this term that we honestly keep seeing everywhere lately, ISO 2022.
Yeah, it seems like a droid from Star Wars. Like, hard to plug into the ISO 2022 port and unlock the blast doors.
Huh? It does sound totally sci-fi. But in reality, it's a global standard for electronic data interchange between financial institutions. Think of it as a new digital language for money.
Okay.
Right now, or historically at least, a lot of banking messages are like sending a text that just says, send $100. It's simple, but it doesn't carry much info. ISO 2022 is more like sending a highly detailed email with attachments, metadata, context, and verification all packed into one packet.
And the source argues that this new standard forces honesty. Like, you just can't lie in the metadata.
That's the big claim. The source argues that under this new system, you can't just have a central bank arbitrarily deciding what a currency is worth based on political whims or because they want to undercut a neighbor. They talk about a global algorithm.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. It feels like we're moving from human decision-making to just machine truth. Trust the code, essentially.
Yes, and this is a key differentiator in this specific theory. The claim is that under ISO 2022, value is strictly derived from data. The algorithm looks at trade balance, foreign reserves, gold holdings, economic output, and it calculates the true value in real time. It's transparency through code. The source actually says, quote, you cannot run a 21st century digital banking system on a 20th century suppressed currency rate. The code simply won't validate the transaction if the numbers don't actually match the real world data.
So if a country tries to say, well, our money is worth X, but the algorithm looks at the data and says, actually, based on your oil and your gold, it's worth Y, the system just rejects the lower value.
That's the theory. It creates what they call a truth reconcile, where the suppressed rate is just viewed as an error by the system.
And they claim there is evidence of this happening right now, because usually these kinds of things happen behind closed doors. We don't see the system updates installing.
Right, but they point to structural evidence within the banking sector. They claim commercial banks and Tier 1 banks, the big boys like Chase, HSBC, Wells Fargo, are currently upgrading their back-end systems. They're updating their Forex platforms to handle wider trading bands.
Testing the pipes, I think the author called it.
Exactly. They describe banks basically running tests to ensure that if the Dong suddenly trades at a much higher rate, say, it jumps from fractions of a penny to over $1, the computer system recognizes it as a valid transaction and not a glitch or some kind of hacking attempt. They are literally coding exceptions into the firewall to say, if this massive number comes through, let it pass.
So they are prepping the system for a massive jump in value. Okay, that's the Vietnam side of the coin. A maturing economy, a need for purchasing power, and a new digital standard that forces the issue. But here is the part that I know a lot of our listeners are actually waiting for, the connection to Iraq.
Yes, the Sympathetic movement.
Right. The source asks the question directly, which I really appreciated. They ask, if I hold Iraqi Dinar, why do I care about Vietnam? And honestly, looking at a map, they are thousands of miles apart. One makes sneakers and electronics, the other has massive oil reserves. Culturally, politically, they're just very different. Why on earth are they linked in this scenario?
So the source argues that while their economies look super different on the surface, their classification in the eyes of the global banking elite is actually identical.
How so? What's this classification?
Well, let's break down the comparison the report makes. First, both are considered frontier economies. Both are in the final stages of post-conflict reconstruction. Vietnam obviously had its war and decades of isolation. Iraq has been rebuilding since the 2003 invasion and the whole ISIS conflict. They are both effectively coming back online after a really long period of being shut out.
Okay, so they are in the same class at school. They're the students who transferred in late and are trying to catch up.
Right, exactly. Second, they're both resource-rich, just in very different ways. Iraq has oil and gold hard assets, incredible amounts of it. Vietnam has manufacturing capacity and rare earth minerals production assets.
Makes sense.
But third, and this is the real kicker, the source argues both have currencies that are mathematically undervalued to an extreme degree.
Undervalued meaning they should be worth a lot more than they currently are.
Significantly more. If you just run the math on Iraq's oil reserves versus the dinar in circulation, the current rate doesn't make any sense. It's severely suppressed. And same with Vietnam's GDP versus the Dong.
And this leads to my favorite metaphor in the whole text, the two pressure cookers.
It's a very vivid image. Imagine two pressure cookers sitting on the exact same stove, the stove being the global economy. The source says the global powers, specifically the IMF and the U.S. Treasury, have kept the lids on both of these cookers tightly sealed for years. They needed stability, they needed banking reforms, and they needed anti-money laundering protocols in place before they could let the steam out. You really don't want a currency to explode in value if the banking system is full of holes.
But now, according to this, Vietnam is cracking the lid.
Exactly. Vietnam is slightly ahead in the economic cycle. They've done the manufacturing work. So the theory goes that if Vietnam is allowed to revalue, to crack the lid and let the steam out, it creates a massive imbalance. Remember that market basket we talked about earlier?
Right, the basket of currencies that defines value in the developing world.
Right. If Vietnam's currency suddenly shoots up in value, it changes the weighted average of that entire developing world basket. The source argues that this effectively forces the hand of the IMF regarding Iraq.
Can you explain that mechanism a bit more? Why does Vietnam going up somehow force Iraq up?
Think about it like competitive pricing. If Vietnam revalues, its economy is suddenly marked as premium. If Iraq stays suppressed, it creates a massive arbitrage opportunity. Iraq becomes unnaturally cheap compared to Vietnam. The source says the IMF simply cannot justify letting Vietnam ascend to a global rate while keeping Iraq trapped in the basement. It would break their models for global economic integration. The gap between the Dong and the Dinar would widen exponentially.
It's like if you have two employees who are equally qualified and you give one a massive promotion and a corner office, you just can't keep the other one in the basement earning minimum wage. Especially if the one in the basement is sitting on trillions of dollars of oil, they'd burn the building down.
That is essentially the argument. The pressure on Iraq becomes unbearable because the disparity is no longer just theoretical, it's operational. The source argues this forces a sympathetic movement.
So Vietnam is the icebreaker.
Yes. Once Vietnam sets the precedent on March 1st, or, around that time frame, the arguments holding Iraq back just evaporate. The source even mentions Prime Minister Sudani in Iraq specifically.
Right, Sudani. They say he's been aggressively implementing banking reforms that mirror exactly what Vietnam did a few years ago.
Exactly. Digitalizing the economy, cutting off illicit dollar auctions to Iran and Syria, forcing the domestic use of the dinar for things like real estate and daily trade. The source sees this as a synchronized dance. They claim Washington doesn't want one country jumping alone. They want a coordinated shift to ensure stability across all the frontier markets. They want the whole class to graduate at once.
So let's get practical here, because I think this is where the rubber meets the road for you listening. What does this actually look like? Because the source is pretty specific that this isn't going to be a guy in a suit walking onto a stage and announcing, "Congratulations, everyone is rich now."
No. There will be no confetti cannons, no balloons dropping from the ceiling. They describe it as a digital event.
Which honestly feels a bit more ominous. It sounds like something that just happens while we're all sleeping.
It likely would be. They outline two scenarios for how this revaluation actually hits the accounts. Scenario 1 is a managed float with a wide band.
Explain that for us. What does a wide band mean in actual practice?
So currently, the currency trades in a very narrow range. It barely moves at all. A managed float means the currency is allowed to move freely based on market demand, but the band, the guardrails of how high or low it can go, is set very wide. This would allow for rapid appreciation over a short period. Basically, the market realizes, hey, this currency is worth way more than it's trading for, and the price rockets up until it hits the new limit.
So it's a steep climb, but not instantaneous. It might take a few weeks or even months to find its true level.
Correct. It allows the central bank to tap the brakes if things get too crazy.
And scenario 2.
A one-time overnight adjustment, shock therapy. The system effectively blinks. The Forex markets close on Friday. The algorithms update the data feeds based on that ISO 2022 true value we discussed, inputting the oil data, the gold data, the trade data. And when the markets open in Asia on Monday morning, the rate is simply different. It's aligned with the new model.
And the source claims the banks are already getting ready for this.
Yes. They mentioned the deafening silence from the official banking sector right now.
Which usually makes people nervous. Like, silence usually means nothing is happening. If there's no news, there's no news.
But the author flips that.
Right.
They argue that in high-level finance, silence implies they are past the talking stage. They are in the integration stage. They are working in the war rooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When you are about to change the value of money for a major economy, you don't tweet about it. You don't leak it to the press because it would cause massive speculation and chaos. You do the work behind closed doors, you sign the NDAs, and you don't say a word until the system is live.
That does make sense. You don't announce a surprise party while you're still hanging the streamers. You wait until everyone is in position. Okay, so let's talk about what this means for the listener. The source calls Vietnam's move the ultimate validation for anyone holding Iraqi Dinar.
Right. Because if the theory holds, the geopolitical tether means if one moves, the other must follow. It validates the thesis that these currencies are assets, not just collectibles or souvenirs.
But they also give some pretty stern advice. And this part felt like a coach giving a halftime speech. They say, stop looking for the rate date.
Which is ironic, given the title of the document is literally the March 1st Global Currency Reset.
Very true.
But the point they are making is really about mindset. They are saying, don't look for a date on a calendar as a lottery ticket. Don't wake up every morning checking to see if you won. That just leads to fatigue. Instead, look for structural evidence.
Structural evidence being the plumbing.
Yes. Look at the banking laws being passed in Iraq. Look at the ISO compliance announcements from the Central Bank of Vietnam. Look at the trade agreements being signed. Watch the plumbing, not the scoreboard. If the pipes are being laid, the water is coming.
And they also say, ensure your house is in order.
This is the practical side. Taxes, identification, know your customer compliance, or KYC. The source warns that these shifts do not announce themselves with a 2-week warning.
That's the scary thought. You wake up, and the world has completely changed, and if your ID is expired or you haven't talked to your accountant, you're scrambling while everyone else is moving.
That is the nature of a reset. It happens when the digital infrastructure is ready and the political button is pressed. The source is essentially telling the reader, you've waited this long, don't let fatigue or skepticism cloud your judgment right at the finish line. Be ready so you don't miss the window because you were too busy looking at the wrong things.
It's a lot to take in. We've got a manufacturing powerhouse in Southeast Asia potentially flipping the switch on a global algorithm, which then forces a resource-rich nation in the Middle East to do the exact same, all tied together by a new digital banking standard that sounds like a robot but acts like a lie detector.
It is a very dense theory. It combines geopolitics, digital banking standards like ISO 2022, and macroeconomics. But what I find fascinating is that it challenges the entire idea that currency value is just a static thing decided by politicians. It proposes that value is about to become much more automated.
And honest.
Ideally, yes. If the value is based on an algorithm of real economic output, real shoes made, real oil pumped, real gold in the vault, it's much harder to manipulate than if it's just a number a central banker picked out of a hat to keep exports cheap. It forces a certain level of economic reality onto the world stage.
So we've unpacked the source, we've looked at the Vietnam catalyst, the Iraq connection, and the digital plumbing underneath it all.
We have. And whether you subscribe to this specific theory about March 1st or not, the underlying trends, the move to asset-backed currencies, the digitalization of finance, the rise of the East, those are very real things happening in the world right now. You can see the shift toward ISO 2022 in almost every major bank's quarterly report. It's not a conspiracy, it's just an infrastructure upgrade.
Absolutely. It really makes you think about what money really is. It's not just paper in your pocket anymore, it's data. It's a scorecard of value.
It is. And the scorecard is currently getting a major software update.
So here is a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. And this comes straight from the logic we just discussed. If money is indeed becoming a digital language, a set of data points defined by global algorithms rather than politicians, what happens to the value of the currency in your pocket if your country refuses to update its operating system?
That is the trillion-dollar question. If you aren't compatible with the new network, do you have value at all?
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.